Hi biologists, and welcome to your next screencast. Today we'll finish chapter 21 in our discussion of population ecology. When we left off, we were talking about population growth. We talked about how population growth is influenced by births and deaths, and immigration and emigration. Next, we need to understand that there are two types of population growth commonly seen in nature. The first is called exponential growth. In exponential growth, there is unrestricted growth of a population increasing at a constant growth rate. You commonly see exponential growth in populations where things like food, space, and mates are abundant. When you graph population size versus time, populations experiencing exponential growth create a J-shaped curve, like the one you see in this graph. A population's growth rate is expressed as a percentage. A population can grow very quickly, even at a constant growth rate, because every generation gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You can see this with bacteria on a petri dish. Bacteria numbers start off low, but grow very quickly. Human population growth is also considered exponential. This graph shows human population size between 1800 and the present. You can see the J-shaped curve often associated with exponential growth. The other type of population growth is called logistic growth. In logistic growth, population growth starts off fast and then levels off. This is because there's an initial abundance of resources and a later lack of resources. Environmental factors will eventually limit an organism's ability to reproduce. One example is access to habitat. Habitat is the physical environment where an organism lives and to which it's adapted. Once a population gets too big, habitat may run out, forcing organisms to live elsewhere where they are not well adapted to or to compete with one another. When population size is graphed versus time, populations experiencing logistic growth will produce an S-shaped curve. At first, population growth is rapid. It then slows down until it reaches zero. For any given population, there's a maximum number of individuals in which an environment can support, given its space and resources. This maximum number is called the carrying capacity and represents the upper limit on the size of any population that an environment can maintain for a long period of time. The illustration on this slide shows a goldfish population that has exceeded its carrying capacity and another goldfish population that is under its carrying capacity. In this infographic, you have a graph of exponential growth side by side with a graph of logistic growth. Notice that in logistic growth that there's a carrying capacity represented by a dashed gray line. Also notice that in logistic growth, you can surpass the carrying capacity, but this population size cannot be sustained for any long period of time. These are graphs of real data showing logistic growth in populations of yeast and seals. There are a couple fine details that we need to understand in our study of population growth. First, population sizes may fluctuate around the environment's carrying capacity. A population size can go above the carrying capacity, but eventually nature will push it back down below it. Second, disease and food shortage can cause population sizes to shrink. The presence of disease or the absence of food can lower a population's carrying capacity. This allows time for populations to develop resistance to disease and for nature to recover its food supply. At that point in time, a population may begin to grow again. This is called boom and bust, and many populations experience cycles of boom and bust. In this infographic, you can see the cycle of boom and bust in wolf and moose populations on Isle Royale. Wolf and moose populations on Isle Royale are intimately linked. Wolves are predators of moose. When there are more wolves, there are less moose. When there are less moose, there are less wolves, allowing the moose population to recover. A population of organisms does not exist in a vacuum. Populations can and do interact with one another. Anything that affects the size of one population could affect the size of other populations in an ecosystem as well. Researchers saw this on Isle Royale with wolf and moose populations. This infographic highlights some of the interconnections between the wolf, moose, and tree populations on Isle Royale. Moose feed on the twigs, bark, and leaves of trees on the island, and as a result, the moose population is very closely tied to tree health and tree growth there. Ecologists use a wide variety of data in order to monitor the health of populations. We can see this on Isle Royale. Moose scat can be used to look at what moose are eating. Wolf scat contains some wolf DNA. This DNA can be used to make a DNA profile. DNA profiles can be used to track wolves or to understand the genetic relationships between them. Moose bones can tell us how healthy the moose were when they died and how old they were when they died. Moose urine can be used to see how nutritious their diets are. There are different ways in which we can look at the factors that influence population growth. One is by dividing them into density-dependent factors and density-independent factors. Density-dependent factors are factors whose influence on population size and population growth depend on the number and crowding of individuals within the population. An example of a density-dependent factor is predation. When population size increases, predation becomes easier and more frequent. Another example of a density-dependent factor is disease. When population density is high, diseases spread much more easily. One example is canine parvovirus, or CPV. CPV spreads from dog to dog, or in the case of Isle Royale, from wolf to wolf. When there are more dogs or more wolves, there's more spread of CPV. Toxic waste accumulation is another example of a density-dependent factor. As population size and density increase, so does waste production and waste accumulation. At a certain point, it can affect the health of a population and become toxic. In addition to density-dependent factors, we have density-independent factors. Density-independent factors are factors that influence population size and population growth regardless of numbers and crowding within a population. A good example of density-independent factors are weather and natural disasters. A hurricane or a landslide does not change in size in response to population size or population density. Another example of a density-independent factor is climate change. Climate change is thought to have had an effect on moose on Isle Royale. Climate change is causing warmer weather. The warmer weather is causing moose to rest more in the shade. Because the moose are resting more, they're eating less, affecting their health and their population growth. Warmer weather also favors ticks. A study of moose on Isle Royale in 2004 found an average of 70,000 ticks per moose. These ticks feed on moose blood, affecting moose health and moose population growth. This moose is missing fur from parts of its body because it's been rubbing up against trees to remove ticks. The photo on the left shows a close-up of ticks living on the body of a moose. The diagram on the right shows the life cycle of moose ticks. Adult ticks live and feed on the bodies of moose. Eventually, females drop off to lay their eggs and start the cycle all over again. The factors that influence population growth can also be broken down into biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are the living components of an environment that affect population growth. Abiotic factors are the non-living components. For example, disease and predation are examples of biotic factors. Weather and the presence or absence of soil nutrients are examples of abiotic factors. This infographic shows how we can separate the factors that influence population growth into density-dependent factors and density-independent factors, as well as biotic factors and abiotic factors. This infographic shows how the moose population on IRL has been affected by both biotic factors and abiotic factors. Tick parasitism and wolf predation are biotic factors. Climate change is an abiotic factor.